Imagine the Antichrist for a second. Like, what immediately comes to your mind?
Oh, probably the classic stuff. Fire, brimstone, maybe a terrifying dictator figure.
Right, exactly. For most of us, it's this very visceral, deeply ingrained cultural image. You picture the horns, the skies turning this apocalyptic shade of blood red,
Yeah.
or, some charismatic global leader enslaving humanity through sheer terror.
Yeah, the whole Hollywood doomsday package.
Literally.
Yeah.
But what if the architect of the apocalypse wasn't a monster emerging from the abyss at all? What if instead it was a specific, highly optimized piece of IT hardware?
Wait, hardware? Like a computer?
Yes. Specifically, a DL380G4 Hewlett-Packard server rack, just humming away quietly in the sterilized, air-conditioned T-Mobile data center in the Netherlands in the year 2014.
I mean, that completely shatters the entire mythological framework right there. We're so conditioned to look for biblical monsters in the clouds that we totally miss the ones being installed in our telecommunications infrastructure. Right.
Exactly. And that is where we are starting today. Welcome to you, our listener today, the learner. We know you are here because you really crave thorough knowledge. You want those profound aha moments, and you want to look at multiple, sometimes conflicting perspectives without, feeling like you're drowning in information overload.
Which is incredibly easy to do with today's topic.
Oh, absolutely. So our mission for today's deep dive is to be your expert guides through a document that totally redefines the word complex. We are unpacking a highly intricate, self-published manuscript dated December 12th, 2025.
Right. And it's titled The Dawn of the Antichrist by Joanne's J.A. Wickmans.
Yeah. And just a very transparent heads up to you listening right now.
Yeah.
This text is an absolute labyrinth. I mean, it does not fit neatly into any genre at all.
No, it's a wildly jarring blend. You've got sharp geopolitical analysis mixed with fringe internet conspiracy theories, and then these suddenly incredibly harrowing accounts of personal trauma, all wrapped in sweeping apocalyptic prophecy.
It's a lot. We are basically here to pan for intellectual gold in what is essentially a rushing, turbulent river of esoteric and, frankly, deeply troubled thought.
But before we even wade into those waters, we really have to establish a foundational boundary for this entire discussion.
Yes, please. This is crucial.
This manuscript contains highly, highly politically charged content. I mean, it dives aggressively into both left-wing and right-wing ideologies, recent global conflicts, polarizing political figures, you name it.
So let's make this absolutely unequivocally clear to you, the listener. We are not endorsing, we are not validating, and we are certainly not taking sides on any of the political, historical, cultural, or supernatural claims made in this text.
Right. We aren't arguing that the author's political diagnoses of the West are correct, and we aren't just dismissing them as inherently flawed either.
Our sole, unwavering job today is to impartially report and analyze these ideas exactly as the author presents them in the source material. We're treating this manuscript as a profound, albeit super controversial, artifact of modern anxiety.
We're basically dissecting the architecture of a very specific, highly idiosyncratic worldview. To understand a building, you don't have to agree with the architect's choice of materials, right? But you do have to examine how the beams connect.
I love that analogy. Okay, let's unpack this. Because the very first beam isn't even a piece of text.
Yeah.
Before you read a single word of the author's theories, you are confronted with this striking, highly intentional visual metaphor on the opening page.
The graphic, yeah, that image really sets the tone.
It's black and white. You're looking at a tree, and it's growing out of this violently cracked, arid earth. But hovering over, or maybe woven into this cracked ground, is the illusion of water. And right there, completely stranded among the dry roots and the fractured soil, is a fish.
Yeah, and that image is meant to provoke this really deep sense of existential dread. When you look at the semiotics of it, it operates as a flawless visual primer for the whole 2025 manuscript.
How so? Break that down for us.
Well, consider the fish. It's a biological entity that is 100% dependent on a fluid, life-giving environment just to breathe. To place it on cracked, dry earth is to display life actively suffocating in a hostile, unnatural environment.
Oh, wow, yeah.
The author is using this to broadcast his core thesis about the modern human condition. We are the fish. Our society, our modern technological and political landscape, that's the fractured earth.
So we're basically gasping for air in a place that looks like it should support life. I mean, there's a tree there, but it actually lacks the fundamental substance we need.
Exactly. The natural, spiritual, and moral waters that once sustained us have just evaporated or they've been corrupted.
And that feeling of suffocating inside an unnatural environment is the exact foundation he uses to introduce his most terrifying concept. Early in the text, in a section he calls Epigraph the Perth, he essentially rewrites the book of Revelation.
Right. He introduces this framework he calls the infrastructure gospel.
Which brings us right back to that HP server rack in the Netherlands.
Yeah, the infrastructure gospel is where his synthesis of ancient theological terror and modern tech reality becomes razor sharp. Historically, apocalyptic literature always uses the fears of its current era to describe the end of the world, right?
Like the Romans in the first century.
Exactly. The beast was often interpreted as the Roman Empire, operating through military conquest. But fast forward to today, and our author argues something deeply counterintuitive. The modern beast, the true Antichrist, doesn't need to conquer you with an invading army. It conquers you with service.
It arrives wrapped in next-day delivery, seamless streaming, and instant communication.
Yes. The author explicitly claims the beast is clothed in convenience. It promises to ease every single burden of your daily life.
And what's fascinating is how he redefines the infamous mark of the beast because, in fundamentalist circles, there's always been this panic about a physical mark.
Like a literal barcode tattooed on your wrist or an RFID microchip injected under the skin by some shadowy one-world government.
Right, all that Pulp Fiction imagery. But the author strips that away and replaces it with something much more insidious because it is already ubiquitous. The mark of the beast is simply the mandatory requirement to be connected to a digital network.
It's the cost of entry to society.
Exactly. If you want to buy groceries, sell your labor, participate in the public square, or even just verify your identity to access your own bank account, you must be logged into the infrastructure.
And he leaves zero room for ambiguity. He maps this ancient cosmic evil onto incredibly mundane specific hardware. He writes that the beast is the T-Mobile Netherlands network, 4G DL380G4 2014 hell.
That specificity is just staggering to me. Why that exact server? Why 2014?
Well, by linking the apocalypse to a DL380G4, which was a very standard, reliable workhorse server rack deployed everywhere around that time, and pinning it to the 2014 era of 4G network expansion, he's making a profound philosophical claim. He is dragging the metaphysical terror of hell out of the spiritual realm and bolting it into the floor of a data center.
Because 2014 was kind of the tipping point, right?
Yeah, exactly that shift. That was when mobile internet shifted from a luxury convenience to an absolute baseline requirement for modern societal functioning.
It was the moment we went from checking the internet to literally living on the internet.
Precisely. And he writes a fictional doctrine within this infrastructure gospel that simply states, connection is obedience.
Connection is obedience. Wow.
Yeah. The mechanism of control isn't pain, it's dependency. In his theological framework, if you sever the link to this network, you are cast into what the Bible calls outer darkness. But here, outer darkness isn't a fiery pit. It is societal exile.
Rendered invisible.
Invisible, mute, and economically paralyzed.
Okay, I have to throw a wrench into this machinery, though. Let's really ground this in everyday reality for a second.
Sure.
Is calling a standard 4G network the Antichrist just a highly dramatic, hyper-theological way of describing basic smartphone addiction? Like, think about the concept of a digital invisible leash. If I absolutely rely on my GPS app to route me around traffic so I can get to work on time, am I genuinely bowing to a demonic new lord? Or am I just using a highly efficient tool to avoid sitting on a congested interstate for an hour?
That's the logical pushback, yes.
There seems to be a massive illogical leap between saying, oh, this technology has made us overly dependent and distracted, to claiming this routing software is the literal manifestation of biblical evil.
Well, the author anticipates that exact rationalization. You are viewing the GPS as a discrete tool. He is demanding that you look at the cumulative systemic architecture.
A big picture.
Right. When every single tool required for human survival, your banking, healthcare records, your ability to communicate with your family, navigation, employment, when all of that is mediated by a single monolithic, interconnected network owned by unseen corporate and political entities, the qualitative nature of that tool fundamentally changes.
So it's not a tool anymore.
No, it ceases to be a tool you wield and becomes an environment that wields you. The beast of convenience is horrifying precisely because you actually want to obey it. You actively, desperately seek out its mark because the alternative, the outer darkness of being offline, feels like a kind of death.
It's the boiling frog metaphor, But we are the frog, and the water is free Wi-Fi.
Exactly.
We didn't fight the invading army. We actually stood in line for 3 days outside an Apple store to buy the shackles.
And that voluntary subjugation is the crucial prerequisite for the rest of his manuscript. The author posits that this technological trap, this pacification of the human spirit through endless convenience, was merely the stage being set. It softened the global population.
Softened us up for what?
Well, you have to ask the logical next question. What happens when a population that has completely atrophied its independence, a population entirely reliant on a fragile digital web, is suddenly slammed by real-world cascading physical crises?
The convenience evaporates overnight.
But the control mechanisms remain firmly in place. And this transition from digital complacency to physical terror brings us to his geopolitical prophecies.
Which is where the manuscript abruptly shifts from this abstract theological critique of technology into a documented ledger of what he claims is his own prophecy.
Right, he anchors this section in the year 2017.
He claims that while he was living in the Netherlands, he delivered explicit warnings to anyone who would listen. His prediction was twofold. First, that there would be a virus at the turn of the decade, and second, that a war would follow.
He even claims he specifically warned against the panicked rushing of hastily developed vaccines.
Which is wild, because when you look at the timeline from 2017, the sequence of global events aligns chillingly with his stated warnings. By late 2019, the first anomalous reports emerged from Wuhan, China, and by the spring of 2020, COVID-19 had effectively shut down human civilization.
But what's interesting is that the author's focus is remarkably unconcerned with the epidemiological biology of the virus itself.
Right, he doesn't really care about the science of it.
No, he is obsessed with the psychological and sociological reaction of the global population. To describe this phenomenon, he uses an incredibly evocative, almost brutal phrase. He writes, "If a dog is scared, it stays with its master."
Man, that specific phrase just stopped me cold when I read it. It is a visceral, unflinching diagnosis of how humans behave under acute stress.
He uses that scared dog metaphor to explain the sudden, astonishing willingness of panicked populations across the globe to eagerly accept draconian lockdowns, emergency governmental powers, and unprecedented restrictions on their physical movements.
Because the biological terror of the virus hit, and the population already softened by that infrastructure gospel we talked about ran straight to the master.
Exactly. They begged the state, the public health authorities, and the digital infrastructure for salvation. The psychological comfort of having a master to protect you vastly outweighed the desire for individual liberty. People willingly traded their hard-won civil rights for the promise of biological security.
And the timeline doesn't give anyone a chance to breathe either. The moment the acute panic of the pandemic begins to slightly wane, the second half of his 2017 prophecy materializes.
February 2022.
Yes. Russia launches a full-scale mechanized invasion of Ukraine. Suddenly, the biological crisis is replaced by the largest, most brutal ground war on the European continent since the fall of Berlin in 1945.
And the author is very careful to clarify the nature of his war prophecy here. He claims his 2017 warning wasn't just some vague, "Oh, there will be conflict someday."
Oh, it's highly specific.
He explicitly wrote, "We cannot have the war because Russia will work together with Iran, North Korea, and China."
So he predicted the exact composition of the modern axis.
He did. The manuscript includes a global map highlighting these 4 specific nations in deep red. In modern geopolitical analysis, this emerging anti-Western coalition is often referred to by the acronym CRINC: China, Russia, Iran, North Korea.
Think tanks and intelligence agencies call it the axis of upheaval, right?
Right. And the author points to the real-time realization of this exact block as vindication of his prophecy. We are watching Moscow deploy Iranian-engineered Shahed drones against Ukrainian infrastructure. We're watching North Korea load massive shipments of artillery shells onto Russian trains.
And China providing the economic lifeline.
Exactly, the crucial economic and diplomatic cover that prevents the Russian economy from collapsing under Western sanctions. The author's prophecy wasn't just about bullets flying, it was a structural prediction about the realignment of global power into a unified, synergistic front designed to dismantle Western hegemony.
But while he sees this massive, highly coordinated anti-Western machine firing up its engines, his diagnosis of the West's capacity to actually fight back is incredibly grim. I mean, he looks around Europe, his own backyard, and he doesn't see a formidable alliance.
He sees advanced economic decay.
Yes. He points to energy crises, crippling German industry, the fragility of the euro, and just this general societal exhaustion. He even drops this terrifyingly casual, almost offhand warning about the consequences of European economic failure.
Oh, the Hitler quote.
Yeah. He writes, "You don't want Hitler to come back, do you?" He is drawing a direct, chilling line between Weimar Republic-style economic ruin, intense societal fear, and the inevitable rise of fascist dictatorships.
He understands the historical recipe for tyranny perfectly, but his critique of the United States is arguably even more cutting because he attacks the very biology of the American population.
The critique of America is darkly humorous, but it stings because it hits so close to home. He writes this incredible line claiming that Americans are looking for McDonald's before they go to war.
It's a striking image.
It really is. He highlights the skyrocketing rates of obesity, the prevalence of chronic diet-induced illnesses, and a general physical lethargy. It's this deeply cynical observation that a society prioritizing ultra-processed fast food over basic human vitality simply lacks the physical, psychological, and moral fiber required to endure a grueling, existential, multi-year global conflict.
And it raises a vital question about national security that rarely gets discussed in traditional defense circles. How can a nation project hard power and resilience abroad when its own citizens are collapsing under the sheer weight of their own hyperconsumption?
It all ties back to the beast of convenience.
Exactly. This is the ultimate fatal culmination of that concept. The convenience didn't just enslave the population digitally, it literally made them too physically sick and spiritually complacent to fight for their own survival when the wolves finally arrived at the door.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, though. I have to play the skeptic again for a moment.
Go for it.
Is any of this actual supernatural prophecy? Or are we simply analyzing a highly observant, deeply cynical person who was watching the geopolitical tectonic plates shifting for years before the earthquake actually struck?
That's the million-dollar question.
Like, think about 2017. Tensions between NATO and Russia over Ukraine were already high following the 2014 annexation of Crimea. The vulnerability of global just-in-time supply chains to a viral outbreak wasn't a secret in his use true. Epidemiologists had been screaming about it for decades.
True.
And the growing alignment between Moscow and Beijing was visible to anyone reading foreign policy journals. So aren't these predictions merely the logical, inevitable extrapolations of already existing fault lines?
That is absolutely the most rational lens through which to view it. A seasoned intelligence analyst at the Pentagon would look at those exact same data points in 2017 and call it a high probability risk assessment.
Right. Not magic, just good analysis.
The author simply wraps it in the language of supernatural foresight. And if the manuscript stopped there, if it was just a dark geopolitical forecast, it would be an interesting, albeit depressing, piece of geopolitical literature.
But it doesn't stop there.
No, the text refuses to stay within the bounds of rational analysis. The author doesn't claim to just be a passive observer sitting in a cafe in the Netherlands watching the news unfold. He claims an active, telepathic, manipulative role in these global events.
Which completely catapults the manuscript from geopolitical analysis straight into a psychological thriller. Because predicting a war apparently wasn't enough for him. He claims he actively intervened to stop the outbreak of World War III using methods that defy all logic.
Yes. He asserts that he telepathically orchestrated what he calls the Russia hoax in Dutch politics.
Which we have to explain this is a wild claim.
Well, we have to tread very carefully into the psychological architecture of the text here. He specifically anchors this massive telepathic claim to a very real, very embarrassing political scandal in the Netherlands, the Halbe Zijlstra country house affair.
Right. For context for our listener, Halbe Zijlstra was the Dutch foreign minister in 2018. He built up this tough guy reputation by claiming he had personally attended a meeting at Vladimir Putin's dacha, his country house, back in 2006.
And he claimed he was hiding in the back of the room.
Yeah, he claimed he was in the back and distinctly heard Putin detailing his grand imperial plans for a greater Russia, which supposedly included conquering Belarus, Ukraine, and the Baltic states. It was a massive story.
Until it wasn't.
Exactly, it completely unraveled. Zijlstra had to resign in disgrace after admitting he made the whole thing up. He was never at the country house. He just heard a rumor and inserted himself into the story to sound important.
It was a classic political fabrication born of pure ego. But our author looks at that very mundane political lie and claims ownership of it.
He takes credit for the lie.
He writes that he, utilizing his telepathic gifts, projected this false narrative into Zijlstra's mind. He claims he planted the greater Russia story in the political sphere as a deliberate psychic decoy.
But why? What possible reason does a guy in the Netherlands have for telepathically forcing a politician to lie about Vladimir Putin? Like, what's the end game?
He calls it diplomacy by deception. In his convoluted logic, he wanted to spark such a massive, uncontrollable controversy about Russian intentions that it would force the West and the East to the negotiating table.
So you thought a fake scandal would prevent a real war.
He believed that by amplifying the paranoia to a fever pitch, he could force a dialogue that would preempt actual military conflict.
It's just astounding.
Yeah.
And what's wild is how comfortably he rationalizes the massive collateral damage of his alleged psychic campaign. I mean, he points to the entire Russiagate scandal in the United States, the Mueller investigation, the years of intense vitriolic political division, the media frenzy over whether Donald Trump was a Russian asset.
He takes credit for that, too.
He views all that democratic instability as an acceptable minor side effect of his telepathic intervention. He refers to the division of the U.S. as happening circumstantially, like it was just a tiny clerical error in his grand cosmic plan to save humanity.
And his analysis of Donald Trump within this bizarre telepathic framework is highly specific and, well, very unconventional. He doesn't view Trump through the standard lens of American partisan politics.
He doesn't care about Republican or Democrat.
Not at all. He views Trump as the absolute ideal candidate to handle Putin for one specific reason. Trump, according to the author, mirrors him.
Mirrors Putin. He argues that Trump understands the raw, transactional nature of power. Trump isn't burdened by the polite bureaucratic niceties of European diplomacy that Putin usually exploits.
Precisely. The author argues that Trump's stated reluctance to confront Russia militarily, like his hesitancy to escalate conflicts in Syria or provide certain lethal aid to Ukraine during his presidency, wasn't a failure of leadership or some hidden collusion.
How does he see it then?
The author sees it as a divinely timed pause button. He believes his own telepathic disinformation campaign created the bizarre, chaotic political conditions that put Trump in power, which in turn stalled the inevitable outbreak of World War III. He sees himself as basically buying the world time.
Okay, I have to introduce a psychological pushback here, because the mechanism behind this belief is fascinating.
Let's hear it.
Let's look at the psychology of the author. This feels exactly like a die-hard sports fan sitting on their couch on a Sunday afternoon watching a football game on TV. The fan is screaming at the screen, "Run the ball! Run the ball!" And then, when the running back actually breaks free for a touchdown, the fan sitting in his living room genuinely, deeply believes that his screaming caused the play to happen.
That's a great analogy.
Right. How much of this grand telepathic diplomacy is simply a desperate, deeply human psychological defense mechanism? When you are an obscure individual citizen watching nuclear superpowers edge closer to Armageddon on the evening news, the feeling of powerlessness is suffocating.
It's entirely overwhelming.
Isn't it psychologically easier and far more comforting to construct a delusion where you are the secret puppet master pulling the strings, rather than accepting the terrifying reality that you are entirely at the mercy of forces you cannot control?
That is a profound and highly accurate psychological assessment. In psychiatric terms, when an individual is confronted with intolerable powerlessness, the mind can fracture into grandiosity to protect the ego.
The ego has to survive somehow.
Exactly. The blurring of lines between internal psychological distress, spiritual warfare, and international relations is the defining hallmark of this section of the text. He is taking incredibly complex, multivariable geopolitical events involving millions of people and reducing them entirely to the outcome of his own internal psychic struggles.
He made himself the main character in the story of global history.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, this desperate need for control, this absolute fundamental refusal to believe that chaotic, terrible things happen randomly, is not isolated to this one traumatized author.
Not by a long shot.
The author is essentially a microcosm of the entire internet. His psychological mechanism perfectly mirrors the massive, unprecedented wave of conspiracy theories that swallowed the global public during the pandemic years. He's doing on a personal level exactly what millions of people were doing on social media.
Demanding a hidden narrative to explain the chaos.
Precisely.
Which transitions us seamlessly into the text's obsessive cataloging of modern paranoia. Because the author doesn't just stop at his own telepathic adventures. He dives headfirst into the murky, bottomless waters of internet conspiracy.
And he starts with the big one.
The undisputed granddaddy of modern paranoia, the Jeffrey Epstein saga.
The manuscript zeroes in heavily on Epstein's arrest in 2019 and his subsequent, highly suspicious death in a Manhattan federal jail cell.
For the author, and frankly for a massive portion of the global public, the Epstein case was the ultimate, undeniable proof of unseen hands and hidden elite agendas. I mean, here was a man intimately connected to former presidents, European royalty, and Wall Street billionaires running an international sex trafficking ring.
And when the cameras outside his cell malfunctioned, the guards fell asleep and he was found dead, officially ruled a suicide, the public simply refused to accept the official narrative.
The text actually highlights a very specific cultural artifact from that time. It mentions a piece of graffiti painted on a random highway overpass in Ohio that simply read, "Epstein didn't kill himself."
Which became a phenomenon.
That phrase wasn't just graffiti. It became a global meme. It was printed on coffee mugs, shouted at sporting events, woven into television shows. It became a unifying battle cry for a thoroughly cynical public.
But our author, true to form, doesn't just analyze the sociology of the meme. He has to elevate it.
Of course he does.
He claims that, through his telepathic connection to the underworld, he actually knows the absolute truth of what happened in that cell.
What does he say happened?
Well, he adopts this incredibly cryptic, almost burden of knowledge tone. He writes that he prefers to keep his mouth shut about the full extent of the truth, but he drops this astonishing twist. He confirms the conspiracy theorists are right to believe Epstein didn't genuinely commit suicide, but he claims the murder happened because Epstein, and this is a direct quote, asked to be killed.
Wait, asked to be killed. Let's analyze the mechanics of that claim, because it is brilliant in a twisted way. By saying Epstein asked to be killed, the author manages to maintain the core conspiracy, that it was an orchestrated hit, but he completely subverts it by removing the agency from the powerful elites trying to silence Epstein.
Exactly.
Instead, he gives the ultimate agency back to Epstein via this occult telepathic death wish.
And it serves a very specific psychological purpose for the author. It ensures that he maintains his position as the ultimate, unrivaled insider. Millions of people online think they know the secret that the elites killed Epstein. But the author's saying, no, your secret is still just the surface level. I know the real secret beneath the secret.
It is a classic escalation of esoteric knowledge.
It is. And he takes this exact same framework of hidden knowledge and applies it to the sprawling conspiracies that surrounded the COVID-19 pandemic. The manuscript meticulously breaks down 3 distinct, massive conspiracy theories that took root globally regarding the United Nations Agenda 2030 and the World Economic Forum's initiative known as the Great Reset.
Oh, let's dissect these 3 theories, because anyone who spent more than 5 minutes on the internet between 2020 and 2023 saw variations of these narratives dominating the discourse.
Absolutely. So the first one he identifies is the classic New World Order theory.
This is the oldest, most traditional framework, right?
Yeah.
It posits that a shadowy cabal of secret elites, your Bilderberg Group, your Illuminati, your high-level Freemasons, are actively orchestrating global catastrophes like the pandemic to destroy national sovereignty and cement their absolute centralized dominion over the planet.
That's the baseline. Then you have the second variation, which the author labels the Great Reboot.
How is that one different?
This narrative is much more economically and technologically focused. It argues that powerful governments, tech billionaires, and the Davos elite deliberately engineered, or at least weaponized, the pandemic with a specific financial goal to intentionally collapse the old independent economy.
So it's about money and property.
Right. The theory claims the goal was to completely wipe out the middle class, destroy small businesses through lockdowns, and consolidate all global wealth and property into the hands of megacorporations under the benevolent-sounding guise of building back better.
And then there's the third theory, which is perhaps the most politically charged in the modern culture war. He calls it trickle-down communism.
Yes. This framework argues that classical Soviet-style communism obviously failed in the 20th century. So the theory goes, left-wing ideologues abandoned the working-class economic revolution and launched a stealth, decades-long campaign to infiltrate Western institutions.
Like universities, media, and corporate HR departments.
Exactly. And the belief is that by the year 2030, using the cover of extreme climate change mandates and endless public health emergencies, the free world will have unknowingly voted itself into a socialist, authoritarian state where individual rights are subordinate to the collective.
What is crucial to understand here is how the author documents the way specific, often really mundane, real-world policy proposals were instantly devoured by this global paranoia machine. Like, he points to the concept of 15-minute cities.
Right, which in urban planning circles, a 15-minute city is simply a zoning concept designed to improve quality of life. The idea is that neighborhoods should be designed so residents can safely walk or bike to the grocery store, their doctor, and their school within 15 minutes, thereby reducing traffic and carbon emissions.
It sounds like a lovely return to tradition neighborhood design, but that is not how it was received on the internet.
Exactly the opposite. To a populace whose minds had been primed by years of Great Reset and New World Order anxiety, a 15-minute city wasn't a convenient neighborhood plan. It was a blueprint for a climate lockdown.
It was interpreted as the government establishing a designated zone that you would eventually not be permitted to leave without a digital passport.
Yes. And the text also highlights the visceral public backlash against suggestions from climate elites that the general population should transition to eating insect-based protein to combat agricultural methane emissions.
Oh, the bug-eating discourse was inescapable. And to the paranoid mind, this suggestion wasn't about saving the environment. It was about ritual humiliation. It was the ultimate flex of power, the elites forcing the peasants to eat literal bugs while they continue to fly to climate summits on private jets and eat Wagyu beef.
That's exactly how it was framed.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, trying to make sense of this landscape? Early in the manuscript, the author includes a piece of writing called the Pandemic Psalm. In it, he warns of a false shepherd rising in a time of deep desolation, and he laments that the people will welcome the shepherd unawares.
The false shepherd is a powerful motif here.
Are these massive, all-encompassing conspiracy theories actually the false shepherd? Are people so utterly terrified of the World Economic Forum, so fearful of the Great Reset, that they will blindly, obediently follow anyone, any populist politician, any screaming internet influencer, any fringe health guru who simply promises to fight the elites?
This raises an incredibly important sociological question. The author is diagnosing a society that has experienced a catastrophic collapse of epistemic trust. When a population completely loses faith in its foundational institutions, when they no longer trust the government, public health officials, the mainstream press, or the scientific establishment, they do not suddenly revert to believing in nothing.
Because the human brain can't tolerate a narrative void.
Exactly. Instead, they become capable of believing in anything. They become desperate for any framework, no matter how bizarre, that makes sense of the chaos and identifies a clear villain. The global paranoia about unseen hands controlling society is ultimately a macrocosm of the author's own intensely personal, horrific reality.
Which brings us to the moment where the manuscript takes a deeply tragic, heartbreaking turn. The sweeping geopolitical analysis of global elites strips away, and we are left staring at the microscopic, agonizing reality of the author's own life.
It's a very abrupt shift.
We shift from the macro trauma of society to the micro trauma of a single human being.
And we must address the deeply personal trauma documented in the text with the utmost seriousness. The author reveals that as a young child, he was raped while institutionalized in a mental ward.
It's awful.
He explicitly notes the compounding horror of this abuse. He emphasizes that it happened in direct violation of the laws of both the state and the church.
It is the ultimate absolute violation of trust. I mean, you are a child. You are in a facility explicitly designated for care and healing. You are under the legal authority of the state and the assumed moral and spiritual protection of the church. And in that exact environment, you are subjected to the most horrific, power-stripping abuse imaginable.
Yes. And he also casually mentions surviving a lethal asthma attack at the age of 2, an event he views not as a medical recovery, but as a cursed supernatural intervention.
These traumatic anchors define the entire architecture of his existence. From his earliest memories, he feels that he has been marked, violated, and relentlessly manipulated by forces vastly more powerful than himself.
He speaks throughout the text of being tormented by occult parasites, unseen spirits that feed on his energy, and this lifelong accumulation of trauma leads to the most harrowing, desperate self-identification in the entire manuscript. He writes, "I think that I am the Antichrist. I don't want it. I'm not doing this on purpose."
The weight of that sentence is just crushing. When you read it, it is clearly not a supervillain monologue. He isn't reveling in evil. It is a desperate plea for help. He genuinely fears that unseen political and religious elites, working in tandem with these occult parasites, are systematically forcing him against his will into the role of a false messiah.
We must handle this intersection of trauma and grandiosity with deep empathy and analytical rigor. In the psychiatric literature concerning profound trauma, especially trauma involving complete powerlessness and institutional betrayal, it is well documented that the psyche can fracture in an attempt to survive.
The mind must construct a framework to make the unbearable pain mean something.
Exactly. If you are a child victimized by the immense, untouchable institutions of the state and the church, your mind might construct an alternate reality to protect you. It might build a world where you aren't just a helpless victim in a locked room, but rather the central, pivotal figure in a cosmic supernatural war against those very institutions.
The sheer scale of the delusions his mind constructs to cope with his powerlessness is staggering. I mean, the most astonishing, logic-defying claim in the entire book centers around the events of September 11, 2001.
Right, his claims about 9/11.
He asserts that during the 9/11 attacks, he was physically and spiritually forced from what he calls the underworld to interact with demonic spirits guiding the hijackers. And he claims that he fought back against these entities.
He takes direct psychic credit for causing United Flight 93 to crash in a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, instead of hitting its intended target in Washington, D.C.
It is a breathtaking appropriation of a historical tragedy. The established historical reality is the profound heroism of the passengers on Flight 93, who realized they were on a suicide mission, rushed the cockpit, and sacrificed themselves to save the Capitol.
But the author internalizes that massive historical event and claims his telepathic resistance in the underworld was the actual catalyst for the crash.
We have to look at the human mechanism operating here. I mentioned the football fan analogy earlier regarding political control, but let's apply that concept to profound trauma. If you suffer horrific abuse in a mental ward, which is a state of absolute, inescapable, terrifying powerlessness,
Yeah.
isn't claiming that you telepathically took down Flight 93 the ultimate desperate psychological defense mechanism?
It's replacing absolute powerlessness with absolute history-altering power.
Yes. You are taking a mind that was entirely stripped of its agency by abusers, and you are elevating it to the highest possible level of influence. The subconscious logic is heartbreaking. It's like, I couldn't stop what those men did to me in that hospital room, but I was powerful enough to save the United States Capitol building from terrorists.
That is precisely the psychological transaction taking place. The extreme grandiosity is directly proportional to the extreme trauma. The delusion is a structural support beam keeping his psyche from collapsing entirely.
It really is.
But what makes this manuscript so compelling, and the reason we are dedicating this deep dive to unpacking it, is that the author's internal psychological struggle for meaning, agency, and truth in the wake of his personal trauma perfectly mirrors the spiritual and cultural crisis he diagnoses in the Western world at large.
He moves seamlessly from his own brokenness to the brokenness of society. He looks out at the West and sees a culture that has systematically abandoned its foundational narratives. He writes that due to the triumph of secularism and postmodern relativism, people are like naked. The youth is disoriented, like they don't know what they do.
He is describing a massive societal spiritual void. The traditional load-bearing structures that provided meaning and cohesion for centuries, organized religion, stable family units, a unifying national history, have been rapidly deconstructed.
But human beings are inherently meaning-seeking creatures. We cannot tolerate a vacuum.
Exactly. If you remove the cathedral, people will inevitably find something else to worship. They will worship the self, they will worship technological progress, or, most dangerously, they will worship political ideology.
And because this cultural void is so incredibly deep, the specific figures he looks to as heroes or as potential solutions to this crisis are fascinating. He points directly to Dr. Jordan B. Peterson, the Canadian clinical psychologist who became a massive, polarizing global phenomenon.
Peterson essentially became famous by telling disaffected, lost young men to clean their rooms, stand up straight, and take responsibility for their lives.
Right. And the author views Peterson not just as a public intellectual, but as a necessary surrogate father figure. He explicitly calls him like a dad to a generation that has been orphaned by postmodernity.
And amidst this high-level cultural analysis, he includes this bizarre, almost comical, highly specific detail where he claims to telepathically give Jordan Peterson unsolicited medical advice.
Oh, the meat diet thing.
Yes. Peterson is famous for consuming a strict all-meat diet to manage severe autoimmune issues. The author tells Peterson, via telepathy, to stick to the meat diet so he can manage his illnesses and stay alive to continue guiding the youth. But then, in a classic contradictory twist, he paradoxically warns Peterson that if he actually stays on the all-meat diet, it will eventually kill him prematurely.
It's such a strange, jarring mix of deep cultural observation and extreme internet diet culture weirdness.
It really is.
But his desperate search for heroes extends beyond psychologists and straight into the political arena. He explicitly urges that his prophetic message be delivered to three specific political figures: Donald Trump, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and Tulsi
Oh,
Gabbard.
he doesn't view them as standard politicians, though.
No, he sees them as iconoclasts, as rogue truth-tellers who operate entirely outside the corrupt elite establishment that he believes ruined the world.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the most explosive, speculative, and disturbing event described in the manuscript. The text suddenly jumps forward in time, specifically to the date September 10th, 2025.
This part is wild. He vividly imagines and details the assassination of conservative political activist Charlie Kirk on a university campus in Utah.
He writes about this event as if it is a solidified, undeniable historical fact that simply hasn't occurred chronologically yet. He describes Charlie Kirk, the 31-year-old founder of Turning Point USA and a massive figure in the American culture war, being murdered while speaking to a crowd of students.
And the author uses this fictional assassination not as a random tragedy, but as the spark that ignites a final cosmic battle. He frames the murder of Kirk as the ultimate physical manifestation of the battle between good and evil.
He claims that when it happens, the mainstream media and the government will try to brush it off as the isolated act of a lone extremist. But the true believers, the awake public, will see it for what it truly is.
Which, in his mind, is the radical left, which he believes has gone completely insane and now views its political opponents as literal, existential evil, finally taking violent action to silence a champion of free speech. The text elevates Kirk from a political pundit to a sacred martyr who died fighting against the woke zeitgeist.
But this is where I have to step in and point out a massive, glaring, almost tragic contradiction in the author's own internal logic.
Let's hear it.
The author spends the entire first half of this manuscript warning us, terrifying us about the Antichrist. He warns us about a false shepherd who will emerge from the chaos to unite nations politically under false pretenses, offering peace but ultimately delivering totalitarian tyranny.
That's right.
But then in the second half, he turns around and looks directly to populist politicians like Trump, RFK Jr., and Gabbard as the saviors of truth. Isn't he falling headfirst into the exact same apocalyptic trap he is desperately warning the listener about?
Wow, yes. He correctly identifies a spiritual, existential void in the culture, but he is searching for a political messiah to fill it. You cannot fix a broken soul with a ballot box.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you have hit on the central tragedy of the entire manuscript, and quite possibly the central tragedy of our current real-world political era.
It's the ultimate blind spot.
The author correctly, and perhaps brilliantly, identifies the profound spiritual starvation of modern society, but his proposed solution is to try and satiate that spiritual hunger with partisan warfare.
It's feeding a symptom instead of the disease.
The text serves as an accidental warning. The total radicalization of politics, the point where political opponents are no longer viewed simply as citizens you disagree with on tax policy, but as demonic entities that must be utterly destroyed, a mindset that culminates in his fictional assassination of Charlie Kirk, is exactly what prepares the global soil for what he calls the dictatorship of deception.
Right, because when you truly believe the other side is absolute irredeemable evil, you will willingly hand absolute unchecked power to anyone who simply promises to defeat them.
You'll eagerly accept the mark of the beast as long as the beast promises to eat your political enemies first.
Exactly. The dictatorship of deception doesn't announce itself as a tyranny. It doesn't march in with jackboots. It arrives as the great stabilizer. It presents itself as the painful but necessary solution to the chaotic, bloody, exhausting culture war that we ourselves chose to escalate.
It's a terrifying thought.
Okay, we have covered a massive, sprawling amount of ground today. Let's synthesize this journey. We started with a wildly complex, deeply disturbing manuscript written by an obscure author in the Netherlands.
Who operates as this reluctant, deeply traumatized modern oracle.
Right. Through his unique fractured lens, he paints a sprawling picture of a world devastated by the biological shock of COVID, the geopolitical earthquake of the Krink alliance, and the war in Ukraine, and the internal terminal rot of spiritual emptiness and endless culture wars.
And all of this, he claims, is leading to a dawn that only looked like morning, a false dawn.
It is a dark, heavy prognosis. His ultimate fear is that humanity, completely exhausted by plagues, battered by wars, and drained by perpetual polarization, will simply give up. We will eagerly trade our freedom, our autonomy, and our spiritual inheritance for the illusion of stability offered by a deceptive, hyper-connected system of total control.
And this is exactly why we take the time to deeply unpack a document like this. To you, the listener, you might have been thinking at the start of this deep dive, why spend an hour analyzing a self-published manuscript filled with bizarre claims of telepathy, HP server racks, and occult parasites?
Here's why it matters. Because even if every single supernatural claim is purely speculative, even if the telepathy and the prophecies are entirely the tragic byproducts of the author's horrific childhood trauma, this manuscript acts as a flawless, undistorted mirror.
It perfectly, terrifyingly encapsulates the genuine anxieties, the extreme political polarization, the loss of institutional trust, and the deep, bone-weary technological exhaustion of the 2020s.
It is the modern zeitgeist distilled into a fever dream. The author's ultimate warning is deeply, urgently relevant. We are in grave danger of trading truth and freedom for the cheap illusion of safety.
The author ultimately leaves us standing at a crossroads. He frames it as a choice between Babylon and Jerusalem, between a world that runs purely on deception, convenience, and force, and a world that attempts the difficult return to hard truth, spiritual depth, and actual freedom. He sounded his alarm as loudly as he could, however unorthodox and troubled his method may have been.
Which leaves me with one final, lingering, perhaps uncomfortable thought for you to chew on as we wrap up this deep dive. We spent a lot of time talking about the author's infrastructure gospel, the idea that the Antichrist isn't a monster, but a 4G network of pure convenience. And we talked about his intense fear of a coming dictatorship of deception that will arrive to subjugate humanity.
Right.
But take a hard look at how we actually live today. We have already, without a single shot being fired, willingly uploaded our most intimate personal data, our entire financial histories, our private conversations, our biometric facial scans, and our minute-by-minute physical locations to the digital cloud.
And we traded all of that away for the dopamine hit of algorithmic entertainment and the luxury of same-day delivery.
Exactly. If the Antichrist truly arrives, not with fire, but as an optimized service provider offering total frictionless convenience, is it possible that the dictatorship of deception doesn't actually need to conquer us at all? Is it possible they don't need to wage a grand apocalyptic war against humanity because we already spent the last 20 years happily, eagerly building its digital throne, and we've already willingly sat ourselves at its feet, just like that fish lying quietly in the cracked earth, wondering where all the water went?
A profound and chilling thought to end on.
Keep learning, keep questioning. We'll catch you next time.